Hi, my name's Satya. I'm here at the home of my good friend, former Canadian Ambassador Doug Roche. We get together every once in a while to kick ideas around, to talk about the state of the world. Doug is an eminent parliamentarian, a leader of the peace movement in the Catholic Church. I've made my living as a writer and a storyteller for the last 40 years. And we're going to start a series of videos in which we have conversations about the issues that we're facing today, locally and globally. And today we're going to start by talking about the topic of the moment, the coronavirus pandemic.
Well, Satya, it's an honor once again to have you in my own home. And we've had a lot of conversations like this over the years. And both of us, of course, have written books. It's sort of a disease itself to keep turning material out. But I think that these conversations that we're embarking on now will reach into, hopefully, the lives of a lot of people who are looking for reasons for hope in the world.
I couldn't agree more. Well, it's good to see you, my friend.
We've had a lot of conversations in this room over the years, and now we find ourselves in the midst of a world crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Coronavirus is sweeping the world. It has shown the vulnerability that everybody is in the age of globalization. We're not prepared, our institutions are not prepared to deal with all the consequences of the full impact of globalization, and it's taken this crisis of coronavirus to make us think beyond the immediate moment. We have to look into the future now.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with that, but we seem to go through this lesson every 10 or 15 years. And before this, we had the SARS crisis as the millennium began. Then we had the H1N1 flu. Before that was the swine flu. It seems that every time there's a global pandemic, all of a sudden people stop and say, what's going on? I think the signal difference this time is that all the protections that were put into place after the last global health crisis at the beginning of the 2010s were then systematically dismantled. I mean, in the United States, its capacity to predict and fight a pandemic was severely weakened to the point that in the National Security Council, the whole arm of the government that dealt on a security basis with health threats was disbanded by the current American administration. They took $690 million away from the pandemic program of the Centers for Disease Control, essentially shutting it down, and used it to build a wall between the United States and Mexico. This madness and this bizarre personal proclivity on the part of the current president of the United States to equate his ego and his virility with his ability to pretend that a pandemic isn't happening has taken us into crazy town.
But I think that the issue that globalization brings forward is far transcends the Trump presidency. The refusal to accept reality, the real world that Trump exhibits, is certainly to be lamented. But the full meaning of the coronavirus sweeping the world, it speaks to our institutional ability to respond to the challenges that we face. And these challenges that expose our vulnerability go far beyond one country or one issue. We could talk about nuclear weapons, how ill-equipped the system is to cope with a sudden emergency. It can't cope with coronavirus. How would it ever cope with nuclear weapons and with nuclear warfare? And climate change, the long range effects of that all over the world. show that although the United Nations came into existence to bring the world together, so to speak, it's not being utilized to its full potential at all.
Well, don't you think part of that is because successive governments, in many democratic countries, have spent years weakening the United Nations and its institutions, and in weakening the global capacity for response. And even when you look at coronavirus, each country's response is quite different depending on its circumstances. You have India, which only had 73 reported cases, shut all visas down for a month. That if you're returning Indian national, you're going to be subject to 14 days quarantine. If you're non-Indian national, you don't even come into the country unless you have a compelling reason like diplomatic, medical, or whatever. When you look at a country of 1.3 billion people deciding to shut its borders after only 73 cases, you may say that this seems a bit drastic or a bit over the top, but in the long run, it may prove to be a wise way to stop the entry of this disease, the further spread of this disease, because you can see in a country like that, you don't have the capacity that China has for mass quarantine or to entirely lock down cities.
So, Satya, don't you think we need a global plan? Now, the World Health Organization, it's spearheading the efforts to control the spread of coronavirus, does have a global plan, but nations, probably only half or less than half of all the states are following that plan. It has no authority to exercise it. And so the global plans that are put forward for common security in various fields, whether it's economic and social development or environmental or arms control, these plans are subject to narrow interpretations by nationalism. And this is what has slowed down the effect of the World Health Organization. They couldn't even call it a pandemic because certain states were still, such as the United States, were diminishing the reality on the ground, and the UN system has to live with this narrow nationalism.
I think you're bang on point there, because what's really happened is that globalization works best for the positive and for crises when there's a collaborative and cooperative international order that's predicated on countries working together for a defined common good. As you know, the rise of nationalism in the last 4 to 5 years especially has brought chauvinism so much to the fore that the value of multilateralism had become something that was thought to be consigned to the past. Who needs multilateralism when I can go my own way? What coronavirus does is, I think, it fatally and in a catastrophic way really exposes the weakness of that argument and the narrow short-term thinking of that perspective.
When I was watching the news reports on the coronavirus, I began to wonder whether the severity of this moment that we're going through could turn out to be a teaching moment for the world, not only on how vulnerable we are, but how it is absolutely necessary for us to work off of common ground, that our mutual interests, no matter where we are, whether Russia, China, the United States, or Canada, that we're all human beings on this one planet, and that we're going to have to find a way to express our solidarity with one another. So maybe the drastic measures that have been taken on the coronavirus is conditioning us, perhaps, to open our minds to treat ourselves, one another, and to treat the planet differently than we have been.
I think that's the most hopeful and positive outcome one could await, and it may get there yet. But I think that the severity of the coronavirus still hasn't sank through to too many people and too many countries, especially those who lulled themselves into a false sense of security. I mean, one of the aspects of a country like Germany, where Angela Merkel is not sugarcoating anything. She says, look, 60 to 70% of us may become infected. It's your individual responsibility your societal duty to self-isolate unless you're critically ill. That if you feel you have some of these symptoms, yes, we'll get you tested and all that, but the social distancing, the self-isolation, the hand washing, the masks, all of these things are part and parcel. The crisis in Italy is quite shocking because it's the first time in a democratic country, as opposed to a totalitarian one, that an entire country has been put on lockdown. But the reason it works is that people are willing to accept this. I wonder if in the United States you tried any kind of a lockdown, if 30 to 40% of the population would simply refuse to accept it.
Yeah, so this is the problem of a democracy that which everybody feels they have their own right to do, not to be contained or suppressed. If you take China, there the approach to the coronavirus, whatever happened at the very beginning, apparently there was some mismanagement at the beginning, but when they started to realize how serious it was, they went into a regimented approach to the controlling the lives of people, controlling the movements, and it appears that the coronavirus is under control and fading a bit in China. So, what happens in our own society where we don't want to be controlled? It takes leadership that people will trust, and there's so little trust in democratic leadership today that we have a great difficulty responding to emergencies.
Well, that's why I find the Italian and the Indian responses fascinating, because Italy really is the only example of a Western democracy that, when you look at the absolute number of deaths from coronavirus, it's not statistically significant, but that recognize the mortal danger it represents, and the entire population is accepting the shutdown. How do we build that sense of urgency into countries where it's not taken seriously? Today we have in Canada, we're recording this in the second week of March, the Prime Minister has put himself into self-isolation just while he's being tested. And more of us need to do that. That's the sort of leadership example. There are a number of events, public events, that we were to be part of that were canceled today on my way here. Northwest College had a civil society speaker series lined up. It just got canceled this afternoon. While the college keeps on operating, it sees no particular reason to elevate or enhance the risk of a community spread of coronavirus.
Well, we're in a sort of a panic mode now that could turn easily into an overreaction to the coronavirus. I would rather that we had sort of our confidence in our institutions, that the institutions can help us and help society to frame itself in these moments. When I think about the teaching moment of coronavirus, my mind does go to nuclear weapons and how dangerous the world is living constantly, not just coming and going, constantly with nuclear weapons. The danger of an outbreak of nuclear war, and the experts, and starting with the Secretary General of the United Nations, have warned us that this is a perilous moment we're going through with arms control and disarmament structures breaking down. So I'm trying to think here, how can we keep public interest sustained in building institutional respect for the rule of law and dialogue and reconciliation, those matters that are at the basis of how governments react in crises and how people themselves react.
Well, I think you almost have to go society by society. I think in Canada it does work because of our experience in Canadian public health officials managing past crises. The response to SARS was exemplary, and so far the Canadian response to coronavirus has been exemplary. I don't think we're so much in a panic as we are appropriately exercising an abundance of caution. It may be that we were too cautious, but surely better to be too cautious and not to take undue risks while still living your normal life to the fullest extent possible than questioning why institutions are trying to get you to change your behavior.
It seems to me that our world is held together by a very thin string that is susceptible to health conditions, it's susceptible to climate change, it's susceptible to trade wars. People have lost confidence in the ability of governments to resolve problems. So in coronavirus, are we going to, suddenly see that we can fight this ourselves? I mean, everybody taking their own individual action to.
I think there's been an erosion of confidence, but I don't think the confidence is lost. If the confidence had been lost, we'd have pure anarchy and survivalists running everything, and people at each other's throats attacking each other. I don't think that rule of law and civil society has broken down. There's cynicism about the capacity of governments to effectively deal with situations, so that when something like coronavirus arises, and you see the government of Canada, or the government of India, or the government of Italy, within the context of functioning democracies, still being able to exercise controls, appropriate social influences. This is a heartening development. The British response, the French response, the Spanish response, these have all been good. I think what's distorting our view is the echo chamber of the United States, which is so close to us. In Australia, for instance, they have free coronavirus testing for everyone, and there's more than enough capacity. When by and large you look at the Western democratic world, with the exception of the United States, actually this is one of those moments in which respect for institutional capacity and institutional ability has not broken down when it comes to pandemics. But if it's badly handled, it very well could.
But the reason that people are cooperating today, you mentioned Italy, and certainly here in our own country, the cooperation is palpable. But the reason for that is because people are scared. They're scared of this unknown disease that the repercussions of which we don't understand. They're not yet scared of the effects of the two paramount problems in the world that we're living with every day: climate change and nuclear weapons, each of which has the capacity to destroy huge sections of humanity.
Yes.
So do people have to be scared? They have to see something visible and tangible before they'll act and push the political systems to put in laws that will contain nuclear weapons and climate change?
Yes. The short answer, I think, is yes.